The communist tradition has a huge amount of literature on this, um, and so I won't be able to do that any justice today. I'll just try to give probably an introduction to this topic. So basically, what I want to do is to help us understand the revolutionary socialist tradition by contrasting it to some other currents within Marxism and within socialism most broadly. So, as comrades may or may not be surprised to hear, communists such as Trotsky, Clara Zetkin, and Gramsci, among others, were among the most important contributors to this question. So I'll be calling them sort of the revolutionary socialist tradition, and I'll be contrasting them to a number of other currents within the history of socialism. The first being reformism. So basically, I'm on the side of revolutionary socialism, as Firebrand is, and I'll be contrasting that tradition to three other moments within socialism in the 20th century: reformism, ultra-leftism. I'm typing these in the chat. I hope that's okay. Putting on my teacher hat. Ultra-leftism and the so-called Popular Front. And I'll also be citing more recent movements in the 20th century, in particular, Black communism, or what is sometimes called the Black radical tradition, although I don't know if I don't know if I think that that's the best term for some of the communists that I'll be talking about. The Black radical tradition, not tradition. Okay, so let me start with reformism. The engagement of communists with fascism begins around the rise of the fascist party in Italy, which takes over power in a coup in 1922. So at that time, there were two sort of dominant currents within socialism. One was the so-called Second International, represented by the German Social Democratic Party, or SPD, and other reformist parties. The parties basically that had voted for war credits during right before the lead up to the First World War. And the reformists were sort of basically arguing that fascism is simply terror and violence, and sort of they fetishized, or they naturalized, if you want, the power of the bourgeoisie. They thought that the bourgeoisie was so entrenched that there was no point in combating fascism. Basically, it was just for them it was an arm of the bourgeois state, sort of cat's paw of the bourgeois state, if you will, and the basic thrust of Second International strategy, for lack of a better term, was, quote, ignore them and they'll go away, as Tabor and Riddle write in the introduction to Clara Zetkin's great text, Fighting Fascism. So that was one current, the most dominant one among socialists in the 1920s. Around the same time, the Communist International was beginning with the new Communist International, which was founded a few years prior under Lenin's leadership, was beginning to grapple with the rise of fascism in Italy in particular. And it was communists such as, I don't know if comrades have heard of these folks, maybe some of you have, Grigory Zinoviev, a Russian communist, and Amadeo Bordiga, an Italian communist. They formulated what would become known as the ultra-left tendency, or ultra-leftism. And this was basically, it was similar to the reformism of the SPD, but it argued for a more sort of, let's say, pronounced version of fascism as bourgeois terror, as simply sort of a militaristic movement of extreme anti-communism. Ultra-leftism tended to conflate different forms of bourgeois rule. So this is where later on something called the Third Period under Stalin ultraleftism flows right into something, an approach called the third period. So Stalin, like his predecessors Bordiga and Zinoviev, they all argued that basically social, like reformist socialists and centrist parties and the Nazis and the Italian fascists, they were all variants of bourgeois rule, right? So there was no qualitative difference between any of them, and that's why under Stalin during the late 1920s, the Comintern, which after Lenin, Stalin took over, right? They argued disastrously that the Nazis, for example, were co-equivalent to the Social Democrats. Like the Social Democrats, according to the Stalinized Comintern, were, quote, social fascists. And excuse me, sorry, I thought, did someone ask a question? No, okay. So the the ultra left, just to review, so ultra leftism of the early 1920s flowed into it developed into what was called the third period ultra leftism under Stalin. Okay, so far so good. I hope so far it's clear what I'm saying. So maybe a lot of material so far. So please stop me if I'm being unclear at any moment. All right, so this is this sort of ultra leftist, let's say, theory is to be contrasted with yet a third current, which develops later during the mid 1930s, right? Again under Stalin. Stalinism by the mid 1930s for various geopolitical reasons, among them being that Stalin wanted to ally with bourgeois capitalist states, to sort of outflank the rise of Hitler in Germany in particular. Stalinism develops this new theory by the mid 1930s, which becomes known as the, quote, Popular Front. The Popular Front. The Popular Front is the far right, let's say, of communism, as opposed to the ultra left, far left, right? So the Stalinists went from saying that all forms of bourgeois rule are versions of fascism, all are, the Nazis and the Social Democrats and so on are like versions of bourgeois rule, thus both disastrously not aligning with the socialists, the biggest, workers' party at the time, and also minimizing the dangers of Nazism and fascism more broadly. It went from that to saying under the Popular Front, we want to ally with now the good bourgeois, right? The Popular Frontism distinguishes now between fascism, which it characterizes as the extreme form of bourgeois rule, versus the quote unquote good democratic forms of bourgeois rule, such as FDR, such as the Léon Blum governments in France, for example, and so on and so on and so on. So you see like this wild swing from two quite disastrous policies, if you want. One minimizing fascism, to the other one sort of subordinating the working class movement to the capitalist sort of class. So far, what I've set out are the various sort of currents within socialism broadly defined in the 1920s, 1930s, and where communists such as Trotsky and Tsetkin, whom you didn't read about. I think you read mostly about Trotsky, but it's important to know that Tsetkin and Antonio Gramsci in Italy. Tsetkin's a German a communist, a leader, a really important leader in the Comintern, and one of the sort of really amazing fighters for centering women's and feminist questions in the Comintern. And I think comrades may be more familiar with Antonio Gramsci, the leader of the Italian Communist Party, along with Trotsky, whom we all know and love, I'm sure. um, argued for a different path. And I'm going to summarize here profoundly, but basically Gramsci, Trotsky, and Zetkin, they maintained sort of the revolutionary optimism of the communist movement. They basically argued that, and here I'll go to my notes really quick. They argued for working class independence. They argued for um, they argued most importantly for something called the United Front, right? The United Front of working class movements and parties, right? So Trotsky, from the very beginnings of fascism, and Zetkin, from the very beginnings of fascism, are beating this drum of, look, we have to maintain one, working class independence, two, working class organizations have to work with each other and to defend workers, but also to dynamically intervene, to be seen to be defending the rights and the interests of all workers, but also proposing a liberatory path out of the grim, bleak, the structural crisis of capitalism, right? As was happening, the deep crisis of capitalism that was happening in the 1920s and 1930s. So that is, if you remember one thing from this, or two things from this presentation, and I know it's a lot, it's that Trotsky and Clara Zetkin, and I highly, highly recommend, by the way, you read this text called Fighting Fascism. Trotsky gets, I would say, most of his ideas from Zetkin, or they probably are talking with each other a lot. And Trotsky sort of, I think, develops the ideas in this text. This is the earliest sort of revolutionary communist text on the rising fascist movement. And Zetkin has, everything is in here: United Front, working class independence, and also a third element, which is working class self-defense. It's super important that it's fundamental that the working class develop capacities to, if necessary, violently defend itself. Like if fascists are, they understood that fascists basically are a violent, fundamentally violent movement, and they're not going to go away if you ignore them. That you have to physically defend working class spaces, working class lives, and so on, right? Unfortunately, Trotsky and Zetkin's perspective did not win out, but rather the Popular Front eventually won out to various sort of, I will say, at most charitably, very mixed consequences, but negative consequences, let's say. And I know in the IS tradition, from which many comrades come, there's been many important publications on critiquing the Popular Front. So I leave it to you to recommend those texts. I would love to read them myself. So in the few moments I have left, I want to talk about Black communism, because here we have, I think, a different tradition, or sort of more of a critical tradition. So sometimes called the Black radical tradition, but really, if you read, for example, there's a fascinating article by a historian named Alberto Toscano, I'll link it here, who talks about Black American and British Caribbean contributions to anti-fascism. A lot of the people he talks about are like C.L.R. James, George Padmore, W.E.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis, George Jackson. These are Black communists, right? Many of them actually identified as Marxist-Leninists, except for C.L.R. James, who was a Trotskyist and then became a so-called left communist. He has an interesting, curious story. The Black communist tradition is really important here because often, so basically what it's hard to summarize what it's saying. It's a huge tradition, it's complex, but one of the key issues that in particular people like Angela Davis, George Jackson, the Black Panthers argued was that fascism is not a new phenomenon in the West, right? They argued that because the United States in particular, but Europe in general, engaged in colonialism and slavery, right? these were these are early, like early seeds of fascism, the ways they violently repressed people based on racial difference, or the idea of biological race, which comes out of settler colonialism and enslavement, which then becomes, you know, the idea of like biological race under the Nazis, right? So so for the Black radical tradition, it is going to a much deeper history than many of the European-based communists of the early and mid 20th century. And why is that important to point out? Well, it's because it's not a tradition that is very much sort of in a lot of the stuff I was researching for this. It seems like either Marxists don't engage this literature, or when they or there's like liberals or progressives who do, and they say, well, there's this huge difference between what they call European Marxism and Black radical tradition. And what I'm suggesting is, and maybe like a firebrand contribution could be to say, hey, actually, they're not radically different. There's a lot of overlap, but there's different sort of implications because, for example, the Black communists really focused on they said basically liberal democracy is a version of fascism. They sort of went back to that kind of ultra left idea of like there's not much difference between different forms of capitalist orders, like capitalist societies. They're all like in the core they've got fascism, right? And the other thing is that they really focused on the police and the prisons as the most sort of clear examples of fascism in the United States, the police and prisons. So that's, you know, that's really influential for the police abolitionist and prison abolitionist um, movement as we know today. And I think a lot of that movement is quite interesting because it, in a way, it borrows that sort of fascism is everywhere, including the prison system especially, but it is sort of, it becomes quite reformist in a lot of ways. And one fascinating document to look at in this context is the the history of the Black Panthers United Front Conference Against Fascism. I'm linking it here in the chat. The Black Panthers who basically uh, they were making this argument that, you know, the United States is a fascist country, and the way to combat fascism is to have community policing, you know, Black policing in Black communities. And it was critiqued by a lot of Marxists, like revolutionary socialists at the time, as being quite reformist. And you know, the conference was unsuccessful. It was unsuccessful ultimately. It fell apart. And it's a fascinating moment where you see sort of like the Black communist movement really struggling and sort of going in like, it can go in one or two directions. And the late Black Panthers, right, by the mid 70s, are sort of definitely going, I would say, in the more reformist direction. With no disrespect to them, obviously, like none of this is meant to disrespect any of these people who were dealing with, like, they were dealing with really the most vicious forms of racism and imprisonment and brutality from the U.S. state. So um, I'm gonna. This is a lot of stuff, so maybe I'll stop here because I've gone on for over 20 minutes, and I think maybe I'll say one more thing to wrap up, which is I think both the let's say revolutionary socialist tradition of Trotsky, Zetkin, and Gramsci, and the Black communist tradition, in particular, someone like Walter Rodney, who never wavered in his Marxist revolutionary politics, and C.L.R. James, and many others, W.B. Du Bois, certainly should be read in as comradely traditions, you know, as traditions that are trying to build off of each other, rather than as, you know, and you're sort of like smart N+1-y, Boston Review-y, like academic-y, sort of lefty websites. You have this sort of overemphasis of their differences um, and a lack of understanding of, like, you know, there's different Marxist traditions, right? And some of them are actually not that far away from what's being said in a lot of the Black communist traditions. So yeah, so let me stop there. So there's a lot. it was a lot of material, and I hope I've done it modicum of justice.